Hey everyone, welcome to Exploring Health, Macro to Micro. I'm your host, Parker Condit. In this show, I interview health and wellness experts around topics like sleep, exercise, nutrition, stress management, mental health, and much more. So by the end of each episode, you'll have concrete, tangible advice that you can start implementing today to start living a healthier life, either for yourself or for your loved ones. This is another installment of On the Floor. This is a monthly segment with my co-host, Danielle Pellicano. In case you don't know, Danielle is a great trainer and endurance coach and is also one of my best friends. So if you want to learn more about Danielle, please check out episode 3, where she was a guest in the typical conversational interview format. For any new listeners, On the Floor refers to being on the gym floor. Danielle gathers questions from people on the gym floor, and we spend 10 to 15 minutes answering those questions. Today's 3 questions are: what is the biggest lie you hear about health for women? Where's a good place to start for marathon training? And how to make progress towards injury prevention and resiliency. These are all great questions and fun ones for both of us to answer. So I hope you enjoy this month's installment of On the Floor with Danielle Pellicano. Danielle, welcome back. On the Floor, episode 3. Before we kind of got on, we were just talking about, I feel like we're really going to start hitting our stride with this. Why don't you just give everyone a quick update on what's going on with you physically, and then we'll get into this episode.
But the physical affects the mental. If you've been coming to my classes the last 2 weeks, let me apologize in advance. 3 weeks ago, I decided that I would go to Palm Springs and dirt bike. And I do laugh because a lot of people still think it's a mountain bike. This dirt bikes have motors. So it's not motocross. Motocross is jumping off jumps. Dirt biking is like trails, sand, still fun. I unfortunately took a little dump, fractured 4 ribs, and here we are now. And I will say no lesson was learned, other than I would probably not have done that a week out from a very important business trip.
But in any case, here you are. You're on the mend.
Much better. I can laugh. I can't really sneeze. Let's hope that I don't sneeze.
All right, we'll just keep any sort of black pepper away from you. Also, not your first experience with broken ribs. So, I mean, you've done this before. So,
this is true. I mean, I feel you need to throw that nugget out there.
Yeah, you're experienced. On the next episode, we'll get into what happened with broken ribs and a broken back the last time around. So,
Cliffhanger.
Yeah. Let's get into the first question from Annika this week. And again, just a quick recap of the format. We're going to be showing 3 videos, 3 questions that people will be asking. We'll spend some time answering each one. So first one is from Annika, and we'll get started.
As women, we are told a lot about bodies, fitness, and health. And I'm curious to know what is the biggest lie you were taught about fitness, wellness, or health as well?
Okay. Very interesting question.
Yes.
And I think a fun question. There are a lot of different places you can go with this. We haven't talked about this previously, but all you said was that you're probably not going to answer it directly. You're going to kind of pivot. So I'm curious where you want to pivot your answer to with this particular question.
Okay, perfect. So Annika's probably, I actually do know, I think she's like in 24 to 26. So I was stumped for a second when I was thinking about how I was going to answer this question. And I'm putting myself back in my 20s. It is a different lane when you have grown up as an athlete forever. And for me, it's general pop wasn't my training environment. So immediately my mind went to, I find it interesting that I was very much led to believe that I was going to be able to make a living as a professional soccer player. And this is my true answer. So here, on the heels of the women winning the 1999 World Cup, I was a freshman in college. So the women come back, Mia Hamm, Julie Foudy, all of them methodically started WUSA, the Women's Professional League. So here we are in college, now where I'm approaching my junior year, still playing, still studying, but I'm still under the impression that I'm going to make a living as a professional soccer player. So now we fast forward 2002. I graduate, I come back to Minnesota. It's the inaugural year of WUSA, the Women's League. They created 8 to 10 teams. I tried out for the women's Minnesota Lightning, made it. Now I'm like, this is amazing. The first meeting was us being sat down saying our stipend for the year was $20,000 and that we had to generate dollars for our own marketing. So now we had to kind of campaign to pay our way to play. And why I'm prefacing it that way is it was so weird that like it wasn't like I had the like blinders on, like it was truly an opportunity, but it was soul crushing at the same time because 2 years in, here I am at like my mid-20s bartending, sleeping on couches, fully educated, being like, I think I need to get on with my life now. Like that was it. So now I think about it, and now we fast forward 20 years and Kansas City is next, or it's going to be this year in 2024. Kansas City, the Kansas City Current is the women's professional team, and they're going to have the first women's only stadium. I just saw like it's incredible, the announcement, but it is actually, so I'm thinking, and I know it kind of pivots from her question, but like, that's where my mind went immediately, that I think that's how early we were still. Do you know what I mean? Like 20 years, I'm not saying it's gone by in a blink, but we're just now creating that opportunity. And maybe I'll take it back 10 years. I'll be generous. You could be playing professional soccer and making it in Europe or things like that way. Do you know what I mean? But it's come a long way. And I just think like I was at 10 years old. There's a video of me somewhere on a VHS, I'm sure. That's like my parents asking me like, what do you want to be when you're older? I'm like, a professional athlete. And I never wavered from it. So that's how I would answer that question. If it was more from like a true science standpoint, or like, what are all the fads that we're hearing? We were only taught about calories in, calories out. If you counted your calories, you were going to be a fit woman. And that is pretty much the only messaging that was happening 20 years ago, in my opinion.
Okay. Yep. That's not where I thought you were going to go. Well,
interesting though, right?
I had no idea where you're going to take it. Let's be real. But yeah, no. So I appreciate kind of the backstory on that. And also, yeah, fun to, I also didn't know kind of the specifics of the early years of you playing professional soccer. So fun for me as well.
If I could find some photos, which are, thank goodness, not on cell phones. If we can find a hard copy for you, I will be sure to send it to you with that. We could just flash into one.
It will
be outstanding.
I had a few potentials on this one. So I'm actually going to talk about the second one, and then I'll kind of wrap up with the one that I think we could probably go back and forth on.
Sure.
So I'm not a woman. So just to get that out of the way for the question. But to answer, one of the biggest disservices to women was the Women's Health Initiative and sort of the reporting that came out around hormone replacement therapy in the early 2000s. So the report came out and it was a poor interpretation of the data, and then an even worse communication of that interpretation of data. So basically, hormone replacement therapy was halted overnight for basically the entire country, with the concern that estrogen was causing breast cancer at alarming rates. And it was basically it was a poor interpretation of the difference between absolute and relative risk. And to give people an idea of what that is, let's say if Danielle, you today have a 1 in 1,000 risk of developing breast cancer, and then you go on HRT for a year and your risk goes up from 1 in 1,000 to 2 in 1,000. Understanding the difference between relative and absolute risk. The relative increase in risk would be 100%, 1 to 2, a 100% increase. The absolute risk is very small because it's only 1 in 1,000 to 2 in 1,000. So when you hear 100% increase in risk for developing breast cancer, that's a scary as shit headline. And it wasn't that extreme, the data that came out of this, but it was a very poor interpretation and communication of the difference between relative and absolute risk, where the absolute risk of breast cancer did not go up as dramatically as the relative risk would indicate. But relative risk always makes for good headlines, and HRT was basically halted overnight. So I'm not an expert on this, but I did want to give people some resources. So this episode is going to come out on March 25th, which is a Monday. On Wednesday, March 27th, a previous guest, Kristen Mallon, who's the co-founder of Femgevity. She and two women from a company called Womanness are doing a women's wellness online seminar. So I'll link to that in the show notes. But things they're going to discuss on there are holistic wellness, the pros and cons of HRT, sexual wellness, and the challenges of weight gain. So for anyone who's listening and based on my Spotify demographics, most listeners, it's like 80% women. And
Parker, that's fantastic, by the way.
Also between the ages
serious.
of like,
well done. I'm so proud of you.
I think you're a huge driver of that. No. Between
not
the
after
ages
this
of
answer. I think clearly the pendulum has swung back to you.
So anyway, I think that would be a great resource. So I'll link to Kristen. I'll link to that event. And then also another good resource on Instagram is Dr. Kelly Casperson. Have you heard of her?
I have not.
Okay. She's really cool. So she's a urologist. She talks a lot about HRT, midlife, sex, menopause. She has a great podcast and she also has a TED Talk. So I'll link to all of those. So if hormone replacement therapy, menopause, midlife, if any of that stuff is sort of in anyone's concern, those are two really good resources to start. So I can definitely just point you towards those. But I would say hormone replacement therapy under the right supervision of a nurse practitioner or the right type of provider can be very beneficial for a lot of women. And I think a lot of women suffered from the early 2000s all the way up until like really recently with sort of the stigma or like the poor interpretation of the WHI. So that was what I thought the biggest lie was, or the biggest disservice. The other one that I might want to talk about with you is the idea that lifting weights makes you bulky.
I should probably put myself more in like the general pop trainer category when I answer these questions, but that is so not typically my lane, which that's why.
I know.
And I'm not saying that if our listeners don't kind of get who we are at this point, then they need to start back at episode 1 and listen. It's not out of my scope. It's just, I wasn't bombarded with these taglines and theories and thoughts because I'm sorry, I'm just being totally honest. I was always in a very athletic setting, typically with boys. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't even a conversation. Like bulky, it wasn't even my genetic makeup to be bulky. I'm going to be honest. I got bulky because I thought you could drink Mickey 40s and eat burritos in college and still be a great athlete.
and you can.
You're welcome, everybody. I mean, I'm about as real as it gets. I'll still throw one down, but let me tell you, this is you come on. I mean, I'm being serious. Like that conversation didn't even happen. If anything, it was always about performance-based and injury prevention. Yeah. So as much as I feel like I was in the dark, I also feel I almost leapfrogged a lot of conversations because it was just treating me as an athlete and everything I did was performance-based.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry. And even in my household, I had 4 brothers. Like, come on, everybody. Like it was.
Right. You didn't get a lot of that typical female messaging that was largely driven.
Now to bring it back to, not all jokes aside, it actually it makes a lot of sense to how I was brought up and how I look at things. I'm not saying I'm sitting here and I don't have, I'm not saying that I didn't care about what are things that are very concerning for women. Of course, once you hit puberty, once you're in college, like, yes, there are real conversations. But when I got to start my fitness journey and my relationship with wellness and health, it was so positive, not because we were avoiding conversation, because I was just looked at as an athlete to perform. So I didn't have body images, and I'm just being honest. So it's hard for me to pretend to identify with it. I didn't feel that way. For me, it was like, if I could produce on the field, I was super happy. I could eat what I want. I ate what my mom and dad made, and we sat there as a family, and it was like feast or famine, literally. Like, I mean, good luck getting the last, bread roll. Like, you know what I'm saying? So for me, I feel very fortunate is the best way of saying it. But I guess I wasn't really affected by those things because it just wasn't in my lane, to be fair. Like listening to you, I love listening to you because you're always well researched. I'm serious. It's like, I love it. For me, I didn't want to manufacture some response that was just BS. Like it wasn't, if anything, I was more like, what's the trajectory for women in sport? And that was very important to me. Like I was obsessed with it. So when I actually came to the realization, don't make a joke, but like when you're treated like a boy and you're in youth sports, and I was already playing co-ed, also very before its time. But I grew up in a pretty affluent area in New York and it was accepted and everyone knew me and I was a very good athlete. My barometer is so not a good example for most people. I was so fortunate. I know you're laughing because it's true, right? It didn't hit me. It didn't hit me till I was almost 13. I got to play with boys in sport till I almost made it to high school. That is so abnormal. So for me, yeah, like it's just different.
So I'm not going to belabor the point. I just do want to highlight a few things around that. I think that's still probably, I at least still see it enough on social media around that idea where I think it's still a thing. It's probably worth addressing. So I think when women get the idea that like, oh, lifting weights is going to make you bulky, they've probably seen a woman. I say that, and they probably have an image in their mind of like a woman who does actually look very bulky, probably built kind of like me. But understand, like, that person has been strength training a minimum 3 times a week at a really high intensity level and hitting really high protein intake levels for probably 5+ years. And I say 3 times a week is a minimum. It's probably closer to 5 times a week on average. And they are hammering the strength training. Like nobody accidentally ends up with like big delts and broad traps and, you know, really wide lats, anything like that. Like it doesn't accidentally happen. And in fact, like I think once you start strength training, like somewhat seriously, you, as a woman, you end up wishing it was actually easier, to put on muscle mass, because it does take so much time and effort and protein. And the recovery is such a huge aspect of it, where it's a very challenging thing to put on muscle mass. But muscle is this metabolic sink for your body, where it just makes some of the metabolic processes in your body just run so much more efficiently. I'll briefly get into one of the big ones, which is glucose disposal. So when you eat food, a lot of it's broken down into glucose. So a lot of people probably know of blood sugar, and that's it's a more popular topic right now because of CGMs are becoming, continuous glucose monitors becoming more popular. And then, you know, pre-diabetes, diabetes is basically just a continuously elevated level of blood glucose. So your body needs to be able to dispose of that to some effect. You only have a few ways of doing it. One of them is using it as energy, but you can't use it as energy all the time. At some point, you're going to need to store it somewhere. And you can only do that in 2 places. One of them is the liver, but your liver is sort of a set size, essentially. You only have one liver and it's not going to grow. So you can only store so much in there. The other place you can store it is in muscle tissues, stored as glycogen. And luckily, you can do 2 things with strength training that increases the ability to do that. One, you increase the ability to get glucose in. So you get more efficient at sort of drawing glucose into the muscle cell, but then you can also add more muscle tissue, which gives you a larger sink to dispose of that glucose. So even just for the diabetes, pre-diabetes, metabolic health reasons, there are tons of benefits to trying to add muscle mass and doing strength training, not to mention bone health, osteoporosis, like all of that. There's so many benefits to strength training. And I think it's really disheartening that this idea still exists, and it's a deterrent to women kind of moving beyond the 5-pound dumbbells. But you see it all the time where it's like, you need to lift heavy.
Not in my class.
They go from like 5s to 10s. Yeah.
Not
exactly.
in my class.
Why you're such a good coach.
Oh, man. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure you squashed that shit.
Oh, please. It's incredible. It's actually, yes, it is. But you and I talk about this because this is our world. I feel like we are so inundated with the same messaging. It's lift heavy, lots of protein. We're going to probably say it 3 more times in this podcast. I guarantee you. And either our listeners want the answer to change. You know what I mean? Because I keep feeling like some of the questions in regards to stuff is still coming right back to that same answer. And I think if that was what I was even told younger, I would have been like, that's a gift. Wait, just eat more protein and lift heavier. Fantastic. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying it's that simple, but I do think, and I'm going to speak to the trainers out there listening, it's our job to focus on form first. So functional, let's just call it functional fitness. Functional fitness isn't just doing a bunch of weird things in the gym in 3 planes of motion with light bells in your hand. It's like, no, it's like teaching our clients, our athletes, to move in the best way they can. So then when they do go grab the heavier things, they don't get hurt. If you ask me, the reason women aren't lifting heavier is 1000% fear of injury. And you and I should just spitball that on another episode one day. But I thought about it because I'm like, why is this still really the root of a lot of the answers? I can understand because I see it. And I'm running classes with 40 people in them, 40. And I'm still confident enough to have them go grab something. And they question it. They stand there like a stone. And then I'm like, well, then this isn't the class for you. And that sounds awful, but I'm dead serious. I'm like, I just out of principle can't watch you deadlift 10 pounds in your hand at 28 or 30 years old. It's not going to happen. So I'm not saying go grab the 50s. However, I easily have women in my class grabbing 50-pound dumbbells, but their technique has been taught, it's been reinforced, and they've been encouraged. And I'm just going to leave it there. So I will put it back on us as trainers. It's one thing to just say, go grab, but their fear isn't because they can't do it. It's, I don't even know if I have the foundation to press this or pull this. That's on us.
Yep. Okay. That seems like a great place to move on.
I agree.
Okay. Annika,
like, do you like
question.
how crazy Coach D then comes very strict Coach D? I hope people, you know what I was going to say? I hope
you're
people,
like Jekyll and Hyde.
1000%. I specifically don't drink coffee before this episode for you, Parker. You're welcome. But I do encourage listeners to, I hope they sometimes watch the visual. Do you know what I mean? Like our YouTube link. Like I love Spotify, so don't not listen to Spotify on the treadmill and do your thing, but you should take the point to like look at us in a split screen because I think our mannerisms are fantastic.
It's a bit of a logistical thing, but I'll just talk through with you here. So I use a distribution platform. It's called Buzzsprout, where that kind of sends the podcast out to all the podcast players, and then I upload to YouTube separately. But Spotify now has an ability to do video as well. So I might just do Spotify separately.
Oh, interesting.
Just so I can get the video on there as well. So if anyone would be interested in that, it's a little extra work on my end, but if
I know, but you're so handsome, Parker. People would be like, thank you for that tip, Danielle.
If people are going to watch it,
I already look like a crazy person, so they already see me enough. But I was like, no, I would really appreciate if people would watch the split screen.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So watch.
I'm excited for the next question too, by the way.
Maybe we'll get it on Spotify soon. Okay. Question number 2. This is coming from Anthony.
Ready?
I'm ready.
All right. I'm thinking about doing my first marathon this year. Where's a good place to start for training?
Anthony.
Okay. So this is clearly going to be in your wheelhouse, but I'll just give you the notes that I had on this. I had a 3-step process. Number 1, hire Danielle. Step 2, start running. Step 3, crush it. That's pretty much it, right?
This is perfect because you really nailed the last question, and now I'll nail this, and now we'll be back to even.
Okay.
So I thought about this too. Anthony's a perfect example. Anthony's probably early 30s, and he's a big strength guy. He's an alpha coach. He's awesome. He comes to GTX. He's got the sprinter power mentality. He does high rocks competitively. He's serious about running a marathon. So this was a legit question from him.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's awesome. I am going to educate our listeners by doing the following. Building a training foundation prior to starting any program is crucial. So someone like him, based on where your fitness level is, and I mean it as a runner, not how you physically are built. Granted, the couch to 5K person versus someone who's coming to the gym 5 times a week and doing a boot camp class or HIIT, there is a variance there. I get it. But say both of these 2 examples are like, I want to do a marathon. The base foundation doesn't change the concept. Maybe Anthony has a step ahead of this other person I'm referencing, but I wouldn't be different with either of them. You ideally want to build 2 components, your cardiovascular system and your muscular endurance, right? A typical marathon training plan is going to be 20 weeks. That's at least if you're talking to me, whether you're a veteran runner or not, I say 20 weeks is it's the best amount to build up for a marathon. You could probably start at 16 if you're coming off the heels of doing an event and you're an avid runner. I say the base would be like, you want to build a house on sand. Okay. You can't just run out onto the sand and start putting up a roof and walls. You need a foundation. That foundation needs to be concrete. And that's a really good example to give because the concrete, in my opinion, takes probably 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the person. If you're someone who just runs a little bit, meaning I do 3 to 4 miles 2 to 3 times a week, I'm like, okay, you probably can start on a very structured program in 2 weeks. And that's me being a little generous still. If you're someone that's like, I walk a lot, this is something that's always been on my bucket list, your base could be at a minimum, probably 4 weeks going into it. And so what I say is when you know you're ready to start a program that's very fixed. And why I say that is if you were to hire me, for example, I'm not just like speed work, tempo long, but I still very much adhere to that type of concept. Most of us endurance coaches do. We might add in more volume, meaning overall duration of running based on the person and their goal. But those speed works and tempos are very demanding on your body. So the problem is it's not even that maybe your cardiovascular system can't maintain it. You will get injured because your structure, your skeletal structure hasn't been probed correctly to even start, if that makes sense. So typically we over terrain our people, if that makes sense. So we start them. It doesn't matter if you take the intensity as low as you want. The overall volume is what ends up kind of being the killer for it, if that makes sense. And I'm not trying to deter people. If anything, I'm educating you on how to be successful going into it. So what I always say is when you are ready to start a marathon program, you have done half the distance in a long run. Or roughly. So if you are marathoning, I would say you're looking at truly almost a half marathon distance. If you're a half marathoner, you're looking at 6 to 7 miles. You can run that distance and 2 days later, still not feel any aches and pains. Then you know your body's like foundationally ready to now be on a very specific marathon program.
So to dive into specifics, on a 20-week program, so you're probably going to have a long run on the weekends, just to give people an idea who maybe haven't ever done a running program before.
Yeah.
Because you're saying, oh, you need a foundation. I'd love to get concrete about that. How long is that first long run going to be?
For when you're in the program.
Yep. Week
10
1.
miles minimum.
Right. Exactly. So I think a lot of people think like, oh, the ramp can be somewhat gentle. It's like, if you haven't really run, going out and banging out a 10 miler on your first long run of the weekend, that's long.
Well, the problem is that's why I think statistically people training for marathons, usually 40% get injured. 40, it's high. 70% of that 40 is overuse. It's not because they can't do it. It's because the buildup was too much. It was too advanced. And here's the thing. I like to think my success rate's quite high, and it really is amongst my coaching for the past 20 years. But everyone's different. You know, it requires a lot of communication and honesty from your athlete to you. Do you know what I mean? It also because this is a real case. I sometimes get asked to prep someone for a marathon and I'm already under the 16-week window. Don't know who they are. And this happens to me a lot because I have a reputation of like, you're such a good coach. I am a good coach and I will say yes to those people. But now I have to really be careful on how I go about. It's not a cut and paste model. So I'm not like, oh, we'll just take out 4 weeks and insert this for Parker. I will insert it. And now here I am editing it and taking down mostly intensity. If anything, the intensity will drop more than it should, right? To prep someone, because most of my people that hire me also have a very specific time as well. So now we're getting off course because Anthony would be a guy who's like, I just want to finish. And I want to finish like with my arms up and fist pumping and happy, which is actually that is a really good sign of a good coach, in my opinion.
Not crawling over the line.
And I say this to people. I'm like, please don't be that person, or do me a favor, like take my jersey off before you get there. No, kidding. But
kind of seriously.
But because then
it's the brand.
Yes, it is the brand. Exactly. Crawl to the finish. No. But the overuse thing, all of us coaches, that is where we are under a heating lamp the whole time. I'm dead serious. Like I feel it. I'm always like, yeah, it's one of those where it requires a lot of communication and it requires a lot of due diligence on the runner to do the work. So I could go forever on this. I just say it's the rule of thirds. Once you can run not even half, a third of the distance you're trying to do, you're ready, meaning your foundation is built. That made more sense. So I reframed that. Sorry. So 8 to 9 miles, because that made sense. 8 to 9 miles, body doesn't hurt. You're pretty much ready to start a 20-week program for marathon. 4 to 5, you're good for a half.
Okay. Do you ever use acute to chronic workload, or do you kind of use trainer eyes and
I am all training peaks for my software. I love it.
Yeah, I was trying to think.
And I will not train people unless they have a Garmin, like unless you're all in on that level.
Yep.
Because then all the metrics are there. You're not trying to go based off of perceived exertion. And again, I'm not deterring people, but if you're coming to the level that I am, I get hired at this point for like Boston qualifiers and 50Ks and big things now. So it requires me seeing like what is really the training stress on this person.
Yep. Do you want me to talk about acute to chronic workload? Okay. So just to give people, because you were talking about overuse, and it's like, how do you know how much you can progress safely? So this is studied a lot in sports science, mostly for professional athletes, because you need to keep them sort of progressing from a performance standpoint, but not to a point where they're going to end up with those overuse injuries. There's very advanced ways to calculate this, but I'll use like a very rudimentary example where you're looking at chronic workload is going to be the average workload over the past 4 weeks. And I'll give examples of this. And then your acute workload is basically what you've done for this past week. And again, this is just one of the ways to calculate this. So let's say you've been running 10 miles a week for the past 4 weeks. So 10 miles week 1, 10 miles week 2, 10 miles week 3, 10 miles week 4. You divide that, but you add it all up, 40 miles divided by 4. Your chronic workload average is 10 miles per week. If you then start a training program, which is, as you're describing, week 1 is probably going to be 20, 25 miles total volume. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, right, that's accurate. I would say 20. Let's go 25. I do think that's accurate.
25. Okay. So then for week 1, your acute workload is going to be 25 miles.
Correct.
So take your chronic workload average, which is 10 miles per week. And what you're putting on into your acute workload is 250% of your chronic. So that's way over what you want it to be. There's huge injury risk there. The sweet spot is between 130 and 140%. Even 140% is really pushing it. So if you are averaging 10 miles a week, to stay within this acute to chronic workload sort of performance, but still safe zone, you'd be going to 13 to 14 miles per week. So if you're thinking about starting a program that's going to be ramping up to, in week 1, 20 to 25 miles, you want to be pretty close to that, leading up to it. So just so people have context around why some of these overuse injuries occur, if you're like, oh, but I've been running a few days a week, you do a 5-mile run of the week.
I love running. I feel bad because I feel like this conversation will intimidate the novice who's like, I want to get into marathoning. If anything, the takeaway is, you need to take it seriously so you have a successful finish. That is always my thing. And I do train novice, and then I birth them into becoming like just addicted to the sport, which is fabulous. And then the next conversation is not to get them to just be a singular athlete, right? But you have to do the work leading up to it. And it's a month is nothing, but it can't just be, I go to HIIT classes and whatnot. No, there is a methodical way about that. But the muscular part, I actually think needs to be a big focus. Like you need to be strength training at least 2 to 3 days a week. And this isn't like our earlier question and conversation. That can be more endurance based where you're just doing weighted lunges. You're working in 3 planes of motion. You're doing push-ups. You're doing chest press. Like you're just building a stronger foundation, because running just depletes you. It just does. It eats at your muscle. It's one of those things where I hammer it so early in people's programming because it becomes something that you have to start taking away, because the volume of running becomes so high that now you're just doing like risk management with them come week, I would say even like week 12 and on. So those things are important, but I actually look forward to that. It's like, why wouldn't you want to start something like that going in as fresh and ready as you can be?
Yep. Okay. So you had a much more specific answer, but the point is you really need to train before you start training.
Yes.
Okay. Anthony, great question.
I love that question.
All right. And then
I'm moving.
I think
I'm pivoting while you talk about the next question.
So this is going to be coming from Alex. And I think a lot of what you were just talking about is actually going to lead right into this answer as well, or this question.
Oh, I love it.
And a question from Alex.
How do I make progress towards injury prevention and resiliency?
So, I mean, you were kind of already just talking about that. We've been kind of dancing around this the whole time, where I think resiliency is a more robust term and one that I prefer just for the general public as well. But can you just give background as to who Alex is, just so we can answer his question specifically?
Alex mid-30s. I'm guessing their ages. This is why I hope they listen and be like, Coach D, 24. No,
Not even close.
Alex is definitely in his 30s because he's so mature and awesome. How about that? He also is coming and doing Leadville Half with Parker and I, by the way. Alex is you could already tell he's been an athlete his whole life. So his question is obviously very probably pertinent to himself, where he's been sidelines with a hip flexor issue. You know, he works hard, he runs a ton, he's very fast, he's very fit. But as I took him as my example, it's not as though the stages change. Like, I think there are 9 habits to implement to keep injury prevention at bay and to build, as we say, resiliency. And resiliency is like the ability to recover quickly, right? To be able to almost buffer it, right? That makes you resilient. But that's not to make you also feel like, you know, no pain, no gain, push through, things like that. What seems to be such a simple thing, I realize is still the Achilles heel of most of the people I watch and train, because it's another thing to do in addition to the sport. So say, like, in addition to the workout, the warm up. No, I'm not even joking. Like, it's so important. And I would be curious just to like do a survey on how many people really do the warm up I give them. I'm just being dead serious, because you could still just go in and check the box. Clients. Yes.
Yeah.
And now I've even simplified it to 5 minutes, because I'm like, something is better than nothing. Right. But like, I was training a woman yesterday virtually who's a ridiculously gifted runner, 30, maybe 25 plus marathoner. But I remember, because I was making her do stuff, and she's like, you really do this every time before you run. And I didn't even hesitate. I'm like, yes. And I'm like, because it's a signal back to you on what is tight, what seems to need a more attention. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying you just go and you skip down and back and you do your same, but there's like probably 5 things that I do prior to I'm just going to bring it to running. But even if I was just to go do a strength workout, there are like 5 movements that I do for myself that I know, how do my hip flexors feel? Do I have extension? Am I going to have good flexion here? It's how are my calves? How is my ankle mobility? If those things are even remotely shortened or very tight, you are playing with fire as far as running goes. Especially if you're in your 40s. I'm just being honest. Like, you're playing with fire. And then what happens is you become accustomed to feeling like, well, this is just my age and I'm supposed to feel tight and this is a little uncomfortable. Well, all it's going to do is reinforce poor mechanics. So it goes back to patterns and muscle memory. So when you start just kind of ignoring what's not yet a chronic injury, it's like your body's always going to talk to you. You can cut me off anytime, because I have many more points, by the way.
I'll just hop in and give sort of an anecdote. So I got really into breathing and respiration as like a training model of understanding like where shoulder limitations are going to come from. It's like, which part of your rib cage can you not properly expand? Things like that.
I adore you and I love this is how you're starting. Go, continue.
I did a lot of table tests. You know, somebody would come in, I'd test their, internal shoulder rotation, their hip rotation, and, I'd base a warm up around that. So I'd have a very accurate understanding of like where their limitations are. Very specific, right? But it was just like going down the nerd rabbit hole. And, after maybe like 2 years of that, I found that the most effective thing was to not even measure them, was just to put them on an air bike for 5 minutes, and it kind of cleared up all of their limitations anyway.
Interesting.
So the point is, like, if you just get people properly warmed up, and for something like running or even just a general strength training session, just doing something that's reciprocal. So opposite arm and like moving at the same time, running, air bike, things like that. It fixes a lot of problems. So yeah, you can have the most nuanced understanding of sort of range of motion issues and things like that. And without having to know the solutions, you can kind of just get your heart rate up, sweat a little bit, and do something reciprocal.
Yes.
And it resolves so many of those limitations. So just kind of to your point, it's like, yeah, the warm-up's really important. It just fixes a lot of stuff.
But your warm-up can't be just, it still needs to be a little specific. Like your answer, that was very specific. Mine, people have worked with me enough to know, like, I have a style. Let's call it that, right? I just do. And it's worked, and I get people moving in different things. And I hope like I do things repeatedly so that maybe there's always a nugget you take with you. Cause I'm always like, a lot of things I just reintroduce, because why would I change something that I know works? Right. But I also look at it and I'm like, I have to always take my answers more, not to general pop, but more to just the athlete. And I call athletes people that are coming to my classes. Like, those workouts are hard. You're doing like today's workout, half of that hour is on the treadmill doing zone 4. That's borderline sprinting for them. Then taking them down to pretty much a walk, having them do that repeatedly, then taking them to the floor and having them lift heavy. Like, you have to be a pretty confident coach to even want your people to do that. But the cueing matters. The warm up matters. So when I look and I see people just going through the motions without connecting why they're doing something, I will stop it and I will address it, because that kills me. And I don't mean to shame someone by doing it. If anything, I hope you almost like check yourself a little. I'm like, no, this is to save your butt and mine, because you're going to get on that treadmill in 4 minutes from now. And I'm going to ask like the highest effort from you. And if you're so wound up and tight, I wouldn't even like an Achilles, anything is going to curb you for a year. And again, I'm not making this podcast to be all fear-based. That's not it at all. If anything, our messaging is trying to be very direct so that you take it seriously, because the questions, again, aren't changing, but you need to change. Habit is habit. And I think that answers that question for me with injury prevention. I'm like, what is your habit? And they'll be like, what do you mean? I'm like, walk me through, like, what's your habits when you come here? They should be pretty routine. The exercise, the workout of the day, that's going to be a variable that changes. But how you approach that needs to be, you have to be so disciplined. So like when I go through my list, I'm like, proper warm up, cool down, check. Listening to your body, meaning like the couch stretch. If I go into a couch stretch, I could barely get into that lunge. I'm going to spend pretty much my warm up only on strength or lengthening my quads and working on my hip mobility. Done. I'll kind of skip over some of the other stuff, because I also don't want you spending more than 10 or 15 minutes doing something. Right. But if you could barely get into that and your workout's going to go be running again, like, you've already limited your stride, right? So your turnover is going to be not very good. You're going to overcompensate somehow. And so all you're doing is reinforcing bad habits, which is then my next thing, proper technique. I know you're laughing, but like people are going to be like, she's crazy. I'm never hiring this woman. She's very intense.
She is. But
yeah, but I'm 44 and I move extremely well.
Yeah, you're like
that
a
doesn't
fucking
just happen.
gazelle.
Yeah, it doesn't just happen. I feel grateful, but it's because I've done the work. I still do the work. Rest and recovery, boom. Your biggest injury prevention is getting enough sleep and actually listening and not overdoing it, meaning you legitimately have rest days. You don't necessarily take them because you feel you need it. It's kind of strategically worked in. And that, I'm sure a lot of people will raise the brow, and that's a completely argumentative. I get it. But for me, again, being an endurance coach, I plug my people's recovery. I give them the autonomy to insert rest when they feel they need it. And I'm like, I can only do what I could do. I don't see you every day. But if what I'm giving you, like, you're just having a bad week, you didn't sleep well, your kids were up all night, you slept 4 hours, and yet your next workout is 15-mile run. These are very realistic things. And and you work 10 hours, I'll probably be like, maybe we cut that in half. Sorry, you still there?
Yep.
You know what I mean? Maybe you cut that workout in half, or you actually take a full rest day. But that's where you just become very smart in sport and in training.
The last thing I'll say on warm-ups, just to give people a framework, generally, the more intense the workout, the longer the warm-up needs to be. The less intense the workout, the shorter the warm-up can be. So, like you said, if you're starting off on the treadmill, as maybe you do in these classes, and you're almost going into a sprint, if you're in like zone 4, that's pretty intense. So yeah, take the warm-up seriously. And if you're in a class where the warm-up isn't built in seriously enough, you should get there early and like make sure you're getting yourself ready for the warm-up if the warm-up isn't going to be adequately built into that workout.
You're going to love this. And this, because why wouldn't I say it? Because a lot of people are going to be listeners from that class. This is why I break protocol, and the protocol of a lot of the way the Lifetime writes up the GTX, and this is not a negative thing. It's a great class. But if it's a 50-50 workout, if you get to the tread, you're supposed to stay on the tread and finish the tread series before you come to the floor. I flip the block always. Do you know what I mean? So say you race to the tread, because I love to start great. I'm still going to cut you at 5 or 6 minutes and still make you do the floor warm up. And then we might switch again, and then you can finish the last 2 blocks on the tread. But that's me as being a very good coach, because that just answered that question. Do you know what I mean? It's not me just trying to change it up to change it up. It's me being like, in good faith, I could not watch you roll in. You just threw your kids in daycare. You have 5 bags on your shoulder. You've done nothing. This is 80% of my clients. Boom,
no, I totally
treadmill.
believe it.
Oh, for sure. Treadmill. Okay.
Yep.
6 minutes, zone 2. Okay. We ready? Okay. Take it to 16%. I mean,
Yep.
no.
All right. Alex, hopefully that answered your question. Do you have anything else to add on that?
No, I think that was great.
Okay.
I could say gradual progressions in programming, all of this, but again, my other clients will be like, gradual? You throw this kitchen sink at me. I'll be like, yeah, you can handle it.
That's probably true.
100%.
Okay. On the floor, episode 3. Yeah, it's wrapped up. Danielle, thanks so much.
Parker, you're the best.
All right. Thanks everyone for listening. Yeah, and we'll get you the next time around. Hey everyone, that's all for today's show. I want to thank you so much for stopping by and watching, especially if you've made it all the way to this point. If you'd like to be notified when new episodes are going to be released, feel free to subscribe and make sure you hit the bell button as well. To learn more about today's guest, feel free to look in the description. You can also visit the podcast website, which is exploringhealthpodcast.com. That website will also be linked in the description. As always, likes, shares, comments are a huge help to me and to this channel and to the show. So any of that you can do, I would really appreciate. And again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.